Willow Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a gentle pace. Nestled between tall pine trees and surrounded by golden meadows, it seemed like a place time had gently passed by, leaving behind the charm of slower days and friendly faces. The town's elementary school, a modest brick building with white-framed windows and a blue metal roof, sat just a few blocks from the main street. Here, laughter echoed daily from its playground, and the dusty old swings squeaked with the rhythm of childhood joy. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. The sky was a soft blue, painted with wisps of clouds, and the scent of blooming lilacs drifted through the air. Birds chirped from the oak trees lining the schoolyard fence, and the sunlight warmed the ground, making it the perfect day for the children to play outside during their lunch break. As always, the bell rang at exactly 12 p.m., and the children, ages 5 to 11, spilled out into the yard like a burst of energy. Among the youngest of them was a 5-year-old girl named Emma Thompson. Emma had soft brown curls tied into neat pigtails and always wore bright-colored socks that mismatched on purpose for fun, she would say. Her spirit was as bright as her clothes, and she had a natural curiosity that made her ask big questions about the world, even when adults didn't have the answers. Her teachers often described her as gentle and thoughtful, the kind of child who would stop to help someone pick up dropped crayons or offer a hug to a classmate who felt left out. That day, Emma skipped toward her favorite spot near the sandbox, a shady patch under an old maple tree where she liked to eat her lunch. She plopped down and opened her pink lunchbox, carefully unwrapping her sandwich, which her mother had made with love, peanut butter and jelly on soft white bread, cut diagonally just the way Emma liked. Beside it was a small, shiny red apple and a single homemade chocolate chip cookie tucked into a napkin with a smiling sun drawn on it. As she prepared to take a bite, something caught her eye. Just a few yards away, sitting alone on a weathered bench near the school's outer fence, was a boy she didn't recognize. He looked to be around her age, maybe a little older, and his posture was quiet, almost guarded. He sat with his hands in his lap, his head slightly lowered, his dark hair brushing over his brow. His clothes were simple and slightly worn, and unlike the other children, he wasn't talking, laughing, or playing. He seemed distant, as if he didn't belong, not just in the schoolyard, but maybe not even in this town. Emma tilted her head curiously. In Willow Creek, it was unusual for someone new to appear without notice. Most families had been here for generations, and newcomers were rare. Some of the other kids had noticed the boy too. A few had stared, whispering to each other behind cupped hands, pointing and giggling, not cruelly, but with that thoughtless awkwardness children sometimes have when faced with difference. The boy didn't seem to mind, or maybe he just didn't hear. He sat still, gazing out at the grass as if deep in thought. Emma looked back at her lunch and then again at the boy. She didn't know why, but something stirred in her heart, a quiet pull, like a whisper telling her that this moment mattered. She didn't hesitate. Carefully, she closed her lunchbox, picked it up, and stood. With small, steady steps, she walked across the yard toward the boy, her shoes crunching gently over the gravel path. The playground noise continued behind her, the clatter of jump ropes, the screech of monkey bars, but it felt distant now, like a world apart. The teachers, standing nearby in quiet supervision, noticed her approach. They didn't say anything, just exchanged glances. They knew Emma, knew her heart, and sensed that perhaps it was best to let kindness lead its course. Emma reached the bench and stood in front of the boy. He didn't look up at first, but she waited patiently. After a moment, he slowly raised his gaze, his eyes meeting hers, dark, watchful, and quiet. Emma smiled, that easy, honest kind of smile that only a child can give without expecting anything in return. "Hi," she said gently, "do you want to share my lunch?" And with that simple question, under the quiet spring sky, something began, something neither of them could have predicted. A moment so small, so human, and yet powerful enough to shift the hearts of an entire town. The boy didn't respond right away. He just stared at Emma with a cautious, unreadable expression. His eyes were deep and dark, like still water, not empty, but holding more than any child his age should have to carry. He blinked slowly, as if trying to make sense of her words, as though no one had spoken to him with that kind of gentleness in a long time. The silence between them stretched, but Emma didn't step back or look away. She stood there, still holding her lunchbox, with patient kindness to the other children on the playground. It was just an unusual sight, the new boy, who hadn't said a word since arriving, being approached by someone like Emma. Some of the older kids stopped playing and nudged each other. A few laughed quietly. One of them muttered, "Why's she talking to him? He's weird." But the teachers gave them a quick glance, and they turned away. The air had shifted somehow, as if something meaningful was unfolding right in front of them. The boy looked down at Emma's hands, at the open lunchbox, at the sandwich, the cookie, the bright napkin with the smiling sun. He glanced at the other kids, then back at her, uncertain. He seemed to be weighing something, though even he probably couldn't have explained what. Was it trust, hunger, hope, or was it something else? the simple human need to be acknowledged. Emma didn't pressure him. She just sat down beside him on the bench and opened her lunchbox fully, placing it between them. "It's peanut butter and jelly," she said, matter-of-factly, "and my mom put in a cookie today 'cause it's Tuesday." She smiled again, warm and proud of the small joy she was offering. After another long pause, the boy slowly reached out. His hands were small but rough, with faint smudges of dirt under his fingernails, not from neglect but from life spent close to the earth. He carefully took half of the sandwich, holding it like it was something delicate. He didn't eat right away. He just held it and looked at Emma. She nodded encouragingly. "It's good, I promise." And finally, the boy took a small bite. He chewed slowly, still watching her, as if trying to understand why she was being so kind. No one had asked his name. No one had sat beside him until now. And though he hadn't said a word, his body relaxed just slightly, a shoulder less tense, a breath just a bit deeper. Emma took a bite of her half and swung her feet gently beneath the bench, completely at ease, as though this moment were the most normal thing in the world. His name was Otto, though Emma wouldn't know that. Until much later, his family had once lived in the nearby forests before a fire had forced them to move. He'd been staying with an elder relative, far from everything familiar, and had only recently been brought to Willow Creek. The school hadn't been prepared for his arrival, and the town didn't know quite what to do. He hadn't spoken since arriving, not out of defiance, but from uncertainty, as if unsure whether this place would let him be himself, or ask him to disappear. And so he sat alone. Until now, what Emma had done wasn't loud or heroic. She hadn't made a speech or drawn attention. She had simply seen someone sitting alone and offered what she had. Not just food, but kindness without condition. That bench, usually just a resting place on the edge of the playground, became a sacred space that day. Not because of what was said, but because of what was felt. The other children slowly lost interest and went back to their games. But a few, especially the younger ones, glanced over more often now. Curious, they hadn't seen anyone break through the boy's silence before. And maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to wonder if they could try to. For now, though, it was just the two of them. A girl with a pink lunchbox and a boy who hadn't spoken a word. Sharing a meal, sharing a moment. And though it may have seemed small to most who passed by, something powerful was stirring quietly, like roots, growing underground before a tree ever breaks the surface. There was no grand applause, no crowd gathered to witness it, just a quiet bench, a soft breeze, and two children sharing a sandwich under a maple tree. But for young Otto, that simple act meant far more than anyone could understand. The food, though welcome, wasn't what moved him. It was the gesture, the unspoken message that he was seen, valued, and worthy of kindness. Emma didn't press him to speak. She didn't bombard him with questions or try to pull him into a game. She just sat beside him, content to share space in silence. Sometimes, the loudest way to say "I care" is to say nothing at all. The air around them was filled with children's laughter and playful shouts, but on that bench, the world had slowed. It was as if time had paused to honor this quiet moment between strangers. Otto took a second bite of the sandwich, slower. This time, more certain, Emma offered him the apple next, holding it out gently. He hesitated, then shook his head slightly. She respected that, putting it back without comment. Then, she pulled the cookie from the napkin and broke it in half, offering one piece to him. This time, he accepted. He bit into the cookie, soft, sweet, slightly warm from the sun, and his lips pressed into something close to a smile. Not a big one, not one that would catch a passerby's eye, but enough for Emma to notice. She beamed. She didn't know his story. She didn't know why he was quiet, or where he had come from. All she knew was that no one should have to sit alone, especially not with that kind of sadness in their eyes. The teachers, still watching from a distance, exchanged quiet glances. One of them, Ms. Lane, the first-grade teacher, felt a lump form in her throat. She had taught at Willow Creek for nearly 20 years and had seen children come and go, each one unique in their own way. But she had never seen anything quite like this, a moment so gentle, so pure, that it stirred something deep in her chest. Later, when asked, she would say, it wasn't just that she shared her lunch. It was the way she did it, without fear, without expectation. She didn't see a stranger. She saw someone who needed a friend. Otto glanced around occasionally. Some kids still looked his way, but their stares weren't as curious or judgmental as before. Emma's acceptance had quietly shifted the tone. Even children, often so quick to label and exclude, could feel when something important was happening. The unspoken rules of the playground were changing, not by force, but through example. By the time lunch was over, Otto had eaten more than half the sandwich and finished his piece of the cookie. Emma stood up and dusted off her skirt. She smiled down at him and said, "You can sit with me tomorrow too, if you want." Then she walked off toward her class line, skipping once as if to shake off the emotion of the moment. Otto watched her go. He didn't move right away. He sat there with the empty half of the sandwich wrapper in his lap and the cookie crumbs still on his fingers. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, he felt something shift inside his chest, a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked down at the wrapper, then back toward where Emma stood, chatting with her classmates. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, but in his mind, he whispered the only word that came to him, the one word he hadn't said in days: thanks. He didn't say it out loud, not yet, but it was there, tucked in the corners of his heart, wrapped in the quiet power of being seen. And so, a sandwich and a cookie became more than just lunch. They became symbols of hope, tiny offerings that carried the weight of something far more powerful, kindness given freely, and the beginning of a bond that would ripple through the lives of many more than just two small children. By the time the school bell rang that afternoon, the story had already started to travel, not loudly, not through official announcements or dramatic retellings, but in the subtle, persistent way that meaningful things often do. A teacher mentioned it in the staff room, a student went home and told their parents, a sibling brought it up over dinner, and from there, the story of the little girl who shared her lunch with the quiet native boy took root and began to grow. Willow Creek wasn't a place where things usually changed quickly. It was a small town, tucked away in the hills, where generations lived side by side and everyone shared the same landmarks. The old general store, the community church, the rusted playground that had stood since the 1960s. People here valued routine and familiarity, so when something unexpected happened, even something as simple as a shared sandwich, it stood out. Most people didn't know much about the boy. Some assumed he was new, though no official announcement had been made. Others wondered if he was just passing through. He hadn't spoken to any teachers, hadn't filled out enrollment papers, at least not through normal channels. Some whispered that maybe he didn't even belong there, that maybe there had been a mistake. But others, especially the older residents, remembered stories, names, and faces from long ago. They recognized something familiar in his eyes. The boy's presence stirred a quiet tension that no one quite knew how to name. It wasn't fear or anger. It was more like guilt, a collective awareness of how long it had been since the town had acknowledged the history it was built upon. Willow Creek sat on land that once belonged to native tribes who had lived, farmed, hunted, and worshipped in the area for centuries. Over time, treaties were signed, promises were broken, and families were displaced. The old ways were forgotten, or ignored by many. So when the boy appeared, silent, brown-skinned, and solemn, he reminded the town of something it had buried. But Emma didn't see any of that. She didn't carry the weight of history. All she saw was someone who needed a friend. And in that small act, she unknowingly peeled back a layer of distance that had settled over the town like dust. Ms. Lane, the first-grade teacher, couldn't stop thinking about the moment. That evening, she called her sister, who lived in the next county, just to talk about it. It was so simple, she said, but something about it, I don't know, it just felt important, like it meant more than we realize. Her sister agreed and suggested she bring it up at the next school board meeting. By the next morning, at least 10 parents had heard versions of the story. One mother retold it in line at the bakery. A father brought it up at the gas station. The story wasn't sensational. There were no fireworks, no shouting, no camera crews. It was just a girl, a boy, and a sandwich. But somehow, it made people pause. It softened their tone. It made them look at their children, and at themselves, a little differently. Some wondered why none of the adults had approached the boy. Others reflected on how many times they had looked away from someone who seemed different. Many began to feel an itch of discomfort, not because of what the boy had done, but because of what they hadn't done. Children, too, began asking questions. Why was he sitting alone? Why didn't anyone play with him? Is he coming back tomorrow? Their innocence, untouched by bias, made the grown-ups realize just how far they had drifted from the values they thought they stood for. Emma, meanwhile, didn't think she had done anything special. She came home, put her backpack by the door, and told her mom that she shared her lunch with a new friend. He didn't talk, but he liked the cookie, she added, proudly. Her mother smiled, ruffled her hair, and said, "That was sweet of you, honey." Neither of them knew that by morning, the entire town would be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And, somewhere, in a quiet home on the edge of town, Otto sat on the floor, staring at the napkin Emma had wrapped around his half-cookie. The smiling sun drawn on it made him smile, just a little. He placed it carefully in a drawer, as if it were something sacred. The next morning, in Willow Creek began like any other, or so it seemed. The sun rose slowly over the hills, casting golden light through the mist that hung over the meadows. Birds chirped from rooftop gutters, and the sleepy town came to life, with the familiar sounds of coffee brewing, school buses rumbling, and shop doors opening with a cheerful jingle. But beneath the normalcy, something was different. There was a quiet buzz in the air, a sense of anticipation, though few could explain exactly why. At Willow Creek Elementary, the halls were unusually quiet that morning. Children shuffled in more thoughtfully than usual, their conversations hushed. The teachers, too, seemed watchful, as if waiting for something just out of sight. Emma arrived in her usual way, bright-eyed and wearing another pair of her famous mismatched socks. In her small hand, she carried a brown paper bag, carefully packed by her mom, with 2 sandwiches this time, 2 apples, and most importantly, 2 cookies wrapped inside a napkin, on which she had drawn a bigger, bolder, smiling sun. She clutched the bag close to her chest as she walked through the hallway, her shoes tapping lightly on the polished linoleum. She didn't say much that morning. Not because she was nervous, Emma rarely felt that way, but because she had a feeling that today would be important, even if she didn't know why. When recess came, Emma walked directly to the bench by the outer fence. It was empty. She sat down and waited. Minutes passed, children ran by, some noticing her, some not. A few paused, whispering and pointing toward the empty space beside her. She just sat quietly, holding the lunch bag on her lap. Just when the breeze picked up and ruffled her hair, Otto appeared, stepping cautiously around the corner of the building. He wore the same simple clothes, but there was something different in his eyes this time. Less guarded, less afraid. Emma's face lit up. She patted the space beside her. He hesitated, then walked over and sat down next to her without a word. She opened the paper bag and began handing him his half of everything just as naturally as if they'd been sharing lunch forever. This time, he didn't hesitate. He accepted the food with both hands, gently, respectfully, like it was something sacred. But what neither of them noticed, at first, was what was happening behind them. One by one, students began to notice a return, but instead of laughing or whispering, they just watched. A few kids from the older grades stood near the edge of the playground, staring quietly. Younger students slowed their play to look over. And then, like an unspoken ripple, the teachers noticed too. Ms. Lane placed a hand on her chest as she stood near the lunch monitor, eyes wide and full of something between awe and pride. Then came the moment no one could have expected. From the far edge of the schoolyard, the gate creaked open. Slowly, a line of figures began to approach. At first, they looked like shadows against the rising sun, their outlines still hazy in the golden light. But as they came closer, it became clear. Elders, wrapped in traditional shawls and garments, with long braids and weathered faces full of stories. Behind them, more figures followed, men and women, young and old. Some wore handmade, beaded necklaces. Others carried walking sticks adorned with feathers and carvings. There were nearly 500 of them. They moved in total silence. No one spoke. No one needed to. As they walked across the schoolyard, every child stopped playing. Every teacher stopped speaking. Time seemed to still. They approached the bench slowly, stopping just a few yards away from where Emma and Otto sat. The children looked on in amazement. Some clutched each other's hands. Others held their breath. One elder stepped forward, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes like the sky before a storm. She didn't speak right away. She simply looked at Otto, then at Emma, her gaze gentle, ancient, full of understanding. She nodded once. Otto looked up at her and nodded back. Emma, unsure of what was happening but feeling the weight of it, stood to her feet beside her friend. The woman placed a hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly. Tears welled up in the eyes of teachers, students, and even the principal who had come outside in a rush after seeing the gathering. It was as if something sacred, something long buried, had been honored again, not with speeches or ceremonies, but with a child's kindness and a community's silent awakening. That morning, Willow Creek learned something that no lesson plan could teach. That silence could speak volumes. That healing often comes from the smallest hands, and that a sandwich, a cookie, and an open heart could be enough to change everything. The schoolyard stood in utter silence. Nearly 500 members of the nearby native community, many of whom had not stepped foot on Willow Creek grounds in decades, now stood together in stillness. Their eyes full of memory, sorrow, and pride rested on 2 children sitting quietly on a bench, sharing lunch. The image was simple, but it carried a depth that few fully understood in that moment. Yet, it was clear to everyone present. Something sacred was unfolding. The elder woman who had stepped forward now turned to the crowd. Her posture remained graceful, but her voice, when it finally broke the silence, carried a strength that resonated across generations. "My name is Annika," she began. "I am a storyteller, a memory keeper, and the great aunt of this boy Otto." She looked toward Otto, whose eyes were now fixed on her. Otto did not speak, but he did not look away either. There was trust in his gaze. Emma, sitting beside him, held his lunch bag in her lap. Still uncertain of what was happening but sensing that every second was important, Annika continued. "Our people have lived on this land for hundreds of years. We were born from its rivers, raised under its trees, and carried its stories in our bones. But over time, we were asked to leave. We were told our ways were no longer welcome. Our homes were taken, our names were changed, our voices were quieted. Many forgot we were ever here." A hush fell deeper over the audience. Some of the teachers looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. Others stared ahead, their eyes beginning to fill. Annika's voice softened. "Otto lost his parents this spring, a tragic accident, far from here. He came to live with me, in the same home I was born in, just beyond the ridge. He stopped speaking after the accident. Not because he couldn't, but because the world stopped making sense. He felt invisible, as many of our children do. She paused, her hands lightly clasped together in front of her. Yesterday, a child offered him half of her sandwich, she said, her eyes now locking onto Emma. Not out of charity, not out of pity, but out of kindness. A kind that does not question where someone is from. A kind that does not ask what language they speak or how their hair is worn. A kind that simply sees another human and says, "You are welcome here." Emma's mother, who had come rushing to the school when she heard of the gathering, placed a hand over her mouth. She had packed that sandwich herself. It had been just a simple peanut butter and jelly, something quick on a school morning, but now it felt like a sacred offering, like part of something much bigger. Annika reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a small woven pouch. In our culture, we give thanks with gifts, not gifts bought with money, but those made by hand and heart. She stepped forward and gently handed the pouch to Emma. Emma took it, her eyes wide. Inside was a tiny figure, a doll, no more than 2 inches tall, made from twine, beads, and feathers. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate patterns on the fabric dress and a small sun stitched onto the back. She is a listener doll, Annika explained. We give them to those who remind us that the world still has good in it, that even when we are quiet, someone is listening. Emma clutched the doll tightly, unsure whether to smile or cry. More elders stepped forward after Annika. They didn't speak, but each nodded to the children, placing their palms over their hearts. Some carried small drums and began to tap gently, a heartbeat rhythm that echoed through the schoolyard. Steady, powerful, ancient. Ms. Lane wiped her eyes and looked toward the other teachers. None of them had ever seen anything like this. Not in their lifetimes. Not in their town. One of the older boys whispered, "It's like they came to thank her." "No," said a girl beside him, her voice trembling with awe. "They came to show us something we forgot." And so, in that moment, without a parade, without headlines, without a single camera in sight, the town of Willow Creek was reminded of its roots, of its neighbors, and of the healing power found in one small act of recognition. It was a story that didn't need to be shouted. It just needed to be felt. And felt. It was, in the days following the silent gathering on the school grounds, something unmistakable began to shift in Willow Creek, not just in its classrooms or among the children, but in the very soul of the town itself. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but rather the slow unfolding of something that had long been hidden, a quiet reckoning, and a long overdue awakening. For as long as most residents could remember, Willow Creek had been a place where history was viewed through a narrow lens. School textbooks barely mentioned the tribes who had once called the land home. Town events celebrated the pioneers who settled the area, but rarely acknowledged those who had lived there before. Native culture was seen, if at all, as something distant, part of the past, not the present. But after that morning, after the elders stood in silence, after Annika spoke, after the rhythmic drum beats faded into the breeze, the townspeople began to look around and realize what had been missing: connection, humility, and the truth. It started with small things. Ms. Lane replaced the reading list in her classroom with books by native authors. She invited Annika to speak to the children again, this time in the library, where the shelves were now being reorganized to include indigenous voices. Emma's mom started asking questions about the land they lived on, the names of the tribes that once thrived there, and what could be done to honor them now. Her questions led her to the local council, and soon, a proposal was in motion to create a land acknowledgement plaque to be placed at the school entrance. The mayor, a man not known for emotional speeches, issued a statement a week later. At a town meeting, he stood behind a wooden podium in City Hall, surrounded by officials and a dozen members of the native community, including Annika and Otto. "What happened at Willow Creek Elementary was more than a moment," he said, voice thick with emotion. "It was a message. And we, as a town, have a responsibility to listen, not just to say sorry, but to learn, to ask, and to build bridges that should have never been burned." The crowd gave a long, quiet applause. Some wiped tears, others nodded solemnly. It was a step, not a final answer, but a beginning. In the schools, students started creating art projects inspired by native symbols and stories. They made paintings of rivers, of handprints, of sundolls with smiling faces. One class built a kindness tree on the wall, and on every branch, they hung paper leaves describing small acts of care they had seen or done, from sharing crayons to learning someone's name in their native language. Otto, still quiet, returned to school a few times a week. He didn't speak often, but he smiled more. He began drawing in a notebook that Emma had given him, filling it with sketches of animals, people, and stories. One day, during free reading time, he handed a picture to Ms. Lane. It was of the bench, the lunch bag, the doll, and a circle of handprints surrounding them, all in different shades, all open. Emma, for her part, became something of a quiet hero. She didn't seek attention. When people complimented her, she simply shrugged and said, it was just lunch. But others knew it was more. Children began following her example, not by copying her directly, but by being more aware. They sat beside quiet kids. They asked new students if they needed help. They noticed when someone looked left out. Even the older residents, who had once dismissed change as not our way, began to reflect. Some visited the small native museum in the next town over for the first time. Others reached out to neighbors they'd never spoken to. One farmer donated a section of his land to be used for native ceremonial gatherings, the first in Willow Creek since the late 1800s. The town didn't become perfect overnight. There were still hard conversations, lingering biases, and the work of unlearning old habits. But the difference was this: people were willing to try. Hearts had opened. Ears had begun to listen. It had taken the smallest of gestures, a shared meal between two children, to pull back the curtain on years of silence. And once opened, that curtain could not be drawn again. The community had changed, not just in policy or in programs, but in spirit. They had remembered something ancient, something true, and that memory, born from kindness, continued to ripple outward. Every year after that, on the anniversary of that morning, Willow Creek Elementary held a day of welcome. There were songs, shared meals, and stories told in circles. And at the center of it all stood the original bench, now polished and protected, with a small plaque that read, "In honor of the day we listened, and the girl who helped us here." Years passed, but the story of Emma and Otto never faded from the heart of Willow Creek. Instead, it blossomed into something bigger than anyone could have imagined. A legacy. What began with a quiet child offering half her lunch to a boy who hadn't spoken a word soon became one of the most cherished stories the town had ever known. Emma grew older, as all children do. She moved on from elementary school to middle school and then to high school, always carrying with her a quiet strength, not the kind that comes from speaking the loudest, but the kind that comes from listening, from noticing others, from choosing kindness without being asked. Her classmates often looked at her during difficult times, not because she had all the answers, but because she carried herself with compassion and grace. Emma had never wanted to be famous or praised. She didn't crave attention. But what she had done all those years ago had sparked a change that still echoed through the lives of everyone in Willow Creek. Otto remained a quiet soul. Though he spoke more with time, his voice was still soft, and his words always chosen carefully. He found comfort in drawing, in walking the woods with his granonica, and in the rituals of his people. But he never forgot Emma, her mismatched socks, her smile, and the moment she sat beside him when no one else had. When he was older, Otto began visiting schools across the region with Annika, sharing stories and traditions, teaching children about respect, history, and empathy. He spoke, gently, but with meaning. And whenever he was asked what made him feel safe enough to speak again, he would always tell the same story: a sandwich, a cookie, and a girl who didn't ask questions, just gave what she had. The day of welcome at Willow Creek Elementary became more than a school event. It turned into a town-wide celebration of unity, history, and kindness. Families brought dishes to share, songs were sung in both English and native languages. And every child in the school was given a small handmade doll, not to keep, but to pass on to someone who made them feel seen. The original bench remained where it had always been, now shaded by a small grove of trees planted by the students. Flowers bloomed there in spring, and in autumn, children raked leaves around it. With laughter, the plaque on the bench, polished each year by volunteers, was eventually joined by a second, this one etched with a drawing Otto had made of the moment he and Emma first sat together. Hands full of bread, eyes full of quiet understanding. Emma's story was even written into a children's book called The Bench at Willow Creek. It was illustrated by Otto himself and narrated by Annika's gentle voice in the audiobook version. The book was read in schools all across the state and eventually made its way to libraries and homes far beyond their town. But perhaps the most powerful part of the legacy wasn't the events or the books. It was the change in the hearts of the people. Emma's small act of kindness had taught the town, and later the world, a lesson that no curriculum or council could enforce: that the smallest choices, the ones made without expectation, can carry the greatest weight. That when we reach out to one another with open hands and open hearts, we restore more than relationships. We restore dignity, humanity, and the hope for a better world. Years later, when Emma stood before her graduating class as valedictorian, she didn't speak about her awards or grades. Instead, she held up the small listener doll Annika had given her long ago, now a little frayed, but still whole. "This," she said, "was given to me for listening. But what I've learned is that listening is just the beginning. You have to act, too, even when it's scary, even when it's small, because someone is always watching, and your kindness might be the one thing they need to feel like they belong." The audience stood in applause, not the loud, thunderous kind, but the quiet kind that comes with tears, with memory, with deep respect. And so, the story of a 5-year-old girl and a quiet native boy became more than a tale passed down, became a mirror reflecting back what was possible when kindness met courage, when silence was honored, and when a community chose to listen. A legacy had begun, and it was only just getting started.